Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the launch of a new Chatham House report, Food System Impact on Biodiversity Loss, which was written in partnership with UN Environment Programme and Compassion in World Farming. My name is James Lomax. I am Food Systems and Agriculture Advisor at UNEP, and I'm also a secondee to the Food Systems Summit Secretariat. And it is my job to shepherd you through the next hour and a half. Look, before we get started, I'd like to go over a few things so you know how to participate in today's event. Some of you may be familiar with GoToWebinar already. So just to reiterate, you have joined this webinar listening only, using your computer speaker system by default. Now, that doesn't mean you can't ask questions. You will have the opportunity to submit questions in text to the presenters by typing them into the questions pane situated in the menu on the right of your screen. You may send in your questions anytime during the presentations or during the session. But an important note, if you are a member of the media, please type your name and the outlet you represent before your question. We will collect your questions and address as many as we can during the Q&A session that follows the panel discussion. So now I've got the housekeeping out of the way. Why are we here? This is a very important report. This report demonstrates that food and agriculture is the largest driver of biodiversity loss that we have currently today, up to 85%. And this year is a very important year when it comes to food systems. In 2021, we have several major global events that are happening and that hopefully will create, if you like, that funnel and forcing people, whether it's policymakers, academics, etc., to start to think about how we are going to take a food systems approach to tackle this issue around our current food system. Those events, let me name them. One of them is the United Nations Environment Assembly, which is going to go over a whole 12 months. It can be the start and it can be the end of these discussions. We have the UN Food Systems Summit, which will be in September, convened by the Secretary General. We have the COPs, we have the main meetings of the 3 Rio conventions on climate change, desertification, and biodiversity that can all help us to articulate the problem, the solutions, and the actions that we can take to deal with this. So this session is all about the report. It's all about putting it in the dialogue, getting the problem straight, getting the solutions correct, and thinking about how we can think global but act local when it comes to these issues. So today we have presenters from the UN, from academia, from civil society, and also we're going to hear from youth. And that, I think, is, of course, a very important part of how we're going to get from problem to long-term solution. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the floor, please, to Susan Gardner. Susan Gardner is the Director of the Ecosystems Division at UNEP. So she's a colleague of mine, and in fact, my boss, so I have to be careful what I say. Susan Gardner has over 2 decades of experience in science and environmental policy, working for both the Mexican and the US governments. Her focus before joining UNEP was on marine science and ecotoxicology, which is the effect of pollution on marine ecosystems. Susan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, James. And what you say about the report, the message, it truly couldn't be more clear. Our global food systems is the primary driver of biodiversity loss. And now with the COVID pandemic, the impacts of food systems on biodiversity have really never been more relevant than they are today. The risk of zoonotic diseases like COVID are closely linked to biodiversity loss. It arises from this overlap of an increasingly intensive and industrialized food system and constant degradation of natural habitats, as well as illegal trade and consumption of wildlife. Agriculture is identified as a threat to 85% of species that are currently at risk of extinction. So what does this mean? Well, it essentially means that the way that we farm, consume, and dispose of food affects not only the health of our planet, but our own personal health. Biodiversity loss, it doesn't just mean that we're losing those charismatic hero species that we all love. It means we're fundamentally reducing the resilience of our ecosystems, and in doing so, we're cutting off the vital streams of life-supporting services that they provide. I mean, we're essentially reducing our own resilience. And this report is an important milestone in framing that direct link between our global food system and biodiversity loss. Our current food system is a double-edged sword. It's shaped by decades of the cheaper food paradigm. The paradigm was aimed at producing more, producing it quickly and cheaply, but without taking into account the hidden costs of biodiversity and life-supporting systems and services, and that cost to our health. Cheap, non-nutritious food is normally poorly farmed food as well. Poor access to nutritious food and the consumption of these inexpensive but high-calorie foods are associated with a prevalence of non-communicable diseases like diabetes, heart disease, obesity. We know this globally, that poor diets is a leading cause of death, and it's one of the top contributors to these types of disease burdens in all 6 of the WHO regions. Research also suggests that healthier diets and the resulting lower incidence of these types of non-communicable diseases could actually increase global resilience to pandemics like COVID-19. And this finding of this report feeds into a narrative and a momentum for the UN Secretary General's Food System Summit that you mentioned previously, James. It's coming up this September, and it's the first of its kind. The agenda of the summit is linked to this One Health approach, which is led by FAO, WHO, and the World Organization for Animal Health, and soon to be joined by UNEP, recognizing the fundamental relationship between the health of animals, plants, people, and the environment. The approach is critical for achieving the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And UNEP has been involved in the preparations for the Food System Summit in a number of ways, including by chairing the UN Task Force, which is a mechanism that involves over 30 UN organizations engaged in the summit to ensure that the summit builds on the knowledge and the capabilities of the UN system to be able to deliver on this food systems agenda in preparation for the summit, but also envisioning progress beyond the summit. Truly, the timing of this report could not be more perfect. For example, as you mentioned, the emphasizing the importance of food and mainstreaming in the work of the Rio Conventions to discuss those issues in their conference of parties that are taking place this year, and incorporating these conversations into the UN Environment Assembly, where we have the theme of strengthening actions for nature to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, dividing that into 4 sub-themes of conversation around nature for health, nature for climate, nature for jobs and to reduce poverty, and of course, nature for food. UNEP also plans to host a Global Food Systems Summit Dialogue, where we bring together member states and representatives of major groups to contribute to conversation with an exchange of perspectives to work together for real solutions. So truly, this is a year to accelerate reform. The last 12 months have been really sending us a message, and it's loud and clear that unless we accelerate food systems reform, emerging zoonotic diseases are going to continue to be a reality. But by taking a transformative approach, we're not only decreasing the risk of future pandemics, we can also increase resilience to future pandemics. So, what does this transformative approach involve? Well, that's what we'll talk about today. There were 3 major interdependent levers that were highlighted in the report: changing global dietary patterns, protecting and setting aside land for nature, and farming in a more nature-friendly and biodiversity-supporting way. And Dr. Benton will describe more of this in depth. A transformative approach also means taking responsibility as consumers. The Dasgupta report was launched just yesterday, and he mentioned specifically that food production must be fundamentally restructured to reduce our impact on nature, not just with technology, but by changing our behaviors. So we all have a choice as consumers. We can vote with our forks each and every time that you prepare a plate or you go to the store, to be empowered to decide what sort of food system each of us wants to support, and to think about, where does the food come from? Where is it farmed? How is it farmed? How is it packaged? So in conclusion, our resilience and our ability to recover from zoonotic diseases is inextricably linked to the health of our food systems. And a transformation of our food systems can tackle both of these global challenges, both for human health and environmental health. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Of course, it's not only what policymakers do, it's the choices that we make as well. So thank you so much. From UNEP's point of view, the connectivity with COVID-19 and how we build back better and differently, I think, is something that's been governing our work very much so in the last 10 to 12 months. Thank you, Susan. Now, we've skirted around a little bit, of course, about the food system. We've spoken about the importance of why UNEP thinks this is important, and also plugged it into these global processes. But now let's turn to Professor Tim Benton, who leads the Energy, Environment and Resources Program at Chatham House that he joined in 2016. Is a distinguished visiting fellow when he was also Dean of Strategic Research Initiatives at the University of Leeds. And Tim, please give us the 101 on the report. Thank you so much.
Thank you, James. I hope you can see my screen okay. Hello, everybody. I am going to try and squeeze 60 or 70 pages of report into 10 minutes. I would advise everybody to download the report, and we will post the link in the chat as we come to the end of this session. So, as has already been prefaced, we know that the food system is a major driver, the major driver of biodiversity loss. Susan and James have just given some statistics, but it arises from conversion of native habitats to farmland, the use of farmland in an intensive way that creates monocultural landscapes with little space for nature, pollution arising from agricultural enterprises, whether from pesticides, fertilizers or manure, and of course climate change is majorly driven by our food systems, and that leads further to ecological disruption. Now, when you think about biodiversity and agriculture, as an ecologist, the first thing that springs to mind is this curve, for which there is quite a lot of empirical information now available. And if you look at the relationship between biodiversity and yield, of course, systems that have very little yield, natural systems, have very high biodiversity, and this is the prime place that biodiversity, of course, lives. On the other hand, if you want to have a lot of yield from an agricultural system, you typically have low biodiversity, and you have a land that is specialized really for producing one sort of food. The issue often for thinking about sustainable agriculture is that this curve takes this shape. And what this means that a system in the middle often produces less yield and less biodiversity. And as you can see from the position of this green dot in the middle, we've got about half the yield and about a third of the biodiversity. So this leads to a whole lot of issues that I will unpick in a few minutes. Now, our food system, as we said, is responsible for all of this biodiversity loss. And I want to explain a little bit about why this is the case, not from a biodiversity and ecology perspective, that's all in the report and we can talk about it later, but from a food system perspective. And since the Second World War, we have invested an awful lot in driving up agricultural production on the basis that making food more available and cheaper would be something that is good for societies around the world. And on this panel here, we've got on the left-hand side, food price as a function of cereal yield as a proxy for farming intensity, and kilocalories available per person in the world as a function of intensification. And what you can see is our original design criteria for the food system about driving down prices, increasing availability per capita has worked. But what we can also see is that driving down food prices makes it economically rational to waste food, the left-hand panel on the right-hand side, and it makes it economically rational to overeat food because we're surrounded very often by freely available calories. And what you can see from the right-hand side is that a linear increase in yield or intensity of farming leads to a bigger than linear increase in the externality of waste or poor health that arises. And what this is getting at is that we have driven our food systems to the point that the negatives for waste and human health in this case are driving the system in a way that we don't want it to go. And putting it in another way, Susan mentioned the term the cheaper food paradigm. This notion that we drive food to be more available and cheaper, we drive it through agricultural intensification and trade. That drives climate change. Climate change is increasingly driving a yield decline, and we're saying, oh, the yield's going down, we've got to intensify further. As the yield goes down, we're saying, oh, we need to produce more food to feed the world. We expand the world. That leads to biodiversity loss. As we say, we need more food in the world, we're driving agricultural expansion and we're losing rainforests for soy or for palm oil. As we drive climate change, of course, that drives biodiversity loss. As we drive climate change, it requires more land to suck carbon out of the atmosphere, whether it's a nature-based solution or biomass for energy, carbon capture and storage. That's changing the way that we grow agriculture around the world, which is driving climate change. As we drive yields through intensity, we're driving soil depletion. Soil depletion drives the yield decline, and we're back caught in the circle. As we drive agricultural intensification, that selects and incentivizes growing more and more and more from fewer and fewer crops at greater and greater scale. Monocultural agriculture, intensive, driving biodiversity loss. As we intensify, we drive down the price of food. We increase the rationality of wasting it. That drives climate change. As we concentrate our crops, it becomes economically rational to feed grain to livestock, so we all eat more meat. As we concentrate our crops on fewer and fewer crops, 3 crops to provide 50% of the world calories, that leads to everybody in the world eating the same diets based on calories, leading to malnutrition. As we use more livestock, that drives climate change. As you can see, what we end up with, climate change also reducing nutrients and contributing to malnutrition. This is not a simple system where we can say it's biodiversity is caused by pesticides or biodiversity is caused by land expansion. Biodiversity loss is caused by the intensity of our farming system, which is a ratchet that every time we say we need to produce more food, it makes things worse. So the first key point from the report, focusing only on growing ever more food is detrimental to human health, to biodiversity and to climate change. And we need to focus much more on growing the right food in the right amounts making the food system efficient through enabling people to consume healthy diets sustainably produced with low waste. Healthy diets sustainably produced, let's think about the sustainability. We know that food's footprints are different, and different items of food have very different impacts on the environment. This is data from Poor and Nemechek's great paper in Science a couple of years ago, looking at the greenhouse gas emissions, the land use, the acidification, the eutrophication, two forms of pollution, and the amount of water used to produce 100 grams of protein. The details are well known, of course. Here's just an example. A kilo of beef emits 25 times more greenhouse gases than a kilo of tofu and takes 75 times more land to produce. So that leads us to key point 2. Demand is not a fixed quantity as a function of the number of people. Demand is driven by the choices that we either make as individuals or are forced on us by culture or food environments. We don't need to grow ever more food to feed the world's growing population. We need to empower and enable people to eat healthily and sustainably. And if people make the right choices or are encouraged to have the right choices, it can make a huge difference on the amount of land that is needed and the drivers for biodiversity loss. So that leads to the conceptual 3 levers that Susan mentioned a few minutes ago. Going back to this figure here, we could choose to farm in a biodiversity friendly way, and that would allow us to produce a certain amount of produce, food, and a certain amount of biodiversity. Theoretically, and Henry Ford effectively created the notion that if you specialize, you can produce more of any individual goods. Theoretically, if we split our land into land that was pristine habitat that we preserved and specializing on producing on biodiversity, and land that was high yielding and specialized at producing food, you can end up with a land use that theoretically can give you more of both. However, this notion, sustainable intensification and land sparing, obviously has a lot of problems, because in reality, that often doesn't work, and it doesn't work for a vast number of reasons. We have spillover from the intensively farmed land via multiple routes, nutrient flows, pollution crossing into the pristine habitat, and governance failures, that the more money you make from intensively farmed agriculture, the more there is a pressure to convert the biodiversity rich area to agricultural land. So it tends to drive the expansion of intensive land into pristine areas. So the main point of the report is that there are 3 levers: how we farm, how much land we farm, and how much our dietary demand is. If we all chose to eat lower footprint diets, we would free up the land pressure and allow us both to save pristine habitat and farm in a way that is biodiversity friendly, producing nutritious food, but without the intensification and the pollution costs that come from intensification. So the third key point is that changing demand and its incentives is a key route to reducing the pressure on land, and a key, therefore, enabler of both preserving land for nature and for allowing the space for nature-friendly farming. If we just continue to drive, promoting the production and consumption of calorie-rich foods, it will make it increasingly difficult to both preserve land, because the economic incentives won't be there, and to farm in a nature-friendly way, because people will always make more money out of growing more food. So finally, the recommendations from the report: demand is a key lever that unlocks the different options for farming practices and for sparing land for nature. We've got to get out of this mindset that we've got to grow more food. It's about growing the right sort of foods in the right sort of way, wasting less, taking pressure off the need to grow more in an intensive way, and taking pressure off the need to convert land to make more food. Food, second recommendation, food, as James said, is key for tackling biodiversity that we're talking about in this report with all the details there. It's also key for tackling climate. It's also key for tackling health. And the commonalities of getting the food system right and preserving biodiversity, climate, and improving health should resonate wildly across the major UN treaties, Convention of Biological Diversity, Climate Change, and also the Food Systems Summit. And the third thing in the super year, where we've got these major events happening, is we've got to think better about not just these international frameworks that are brilliant, but translating our local action into those international processes better. We've got to create a better linkage so that my decisions, the decisions that my family make, the decisions my society makes, the decision my country makes, all feed into doing the right sort of thing. It needs cooperation around trade. It needs cooperation around making sure that we are sustainable. And it's not just about individual choices in the home, it's about aligning individual choices, national actions and international actions. So with that, I think I've used up all my time. Thank you very much, and sincerely acknowledge the help from TRWF and UNEP in providing the impetus for this report. Over.
Thank you so much, Tim. You packed a lot into that, so thank you very, very much. And I think, again, I have to reiterate how timely this report is, given these opportunities that we have in 2021 to realize this connectivity, to think global but act local. And thank you very much for presenting this very clear levers for change, if you like. One of the things that I think came out very, very clearly is that the linkages with the Food Systems Summit. We do have in the summit an action track 3 on nature positive food production, action track 2 on sustainable consumption patterns, plus this very, very ambitious approach to get national level dialogues in every single member state this year. So I really hope that we're at the point where we can start to bring that connectivity in, and also try to address some of the key system lock-ins that you are talking about. That is very well described in the cheaper food paradigm. Well, look, thank you so much. But let's move swiftly on then to the next speaker, who is Philip Limbury, who is Global Chief Executive Officer of the leading international farm animal welfare organization, Compassion in World Farming, and a top partner with UNEP and with the Chatham House on this. And I think the genesis of this came from a discussion that the two organizations, UNEP and Compassion in World Farming, had, 2 years ago in Nairobi. So it's great to see something come out of a chat. He's also a visiting professor at the University of Winchester. He's the president of the Eurogroup for Animals, Brussels, and founding board member of the World Federation for Animals. He's also an award-winning author, and I'm proud to say that I have several of his books in my bookshelf downstairs. The floor is yours, Philip.
James, thank you so much. And it's great that, as you say, our conversation 2 years ago has borne such fruit. And it's great to hear Professor Tim Benton today, and to see the Chatham House report showing so clearly that intensification of the food system is reducing biodiversity and affecting our ability to grow food in the future, that we need to feed people rather than factory farms. As a lifelong naturalist who lives on a farm, I see the impact of food production on biodiversity every single day. I'm acutely aware of how cutting down forests and ripping out hedges removes vital habitat for wildlife. It also reduces our ability to replenish oxygen supplies and take carbon out of the atmosphere. As farming has become more intensive, so fields have got bigger, replacing natural soil fertility with artificial fertilizers, using chemical pesticides to kill off nature rather than working with her. All of this whilst removing farmed animals, sentient beings, from the land, divorcing them from nature and placing them in factory farms, caged, crammed and confined. Only this spring, I watched a field being ploughed, only to discover that the soil had no worms. I should have known because the birds had already worked it out. The local gulls that normally follow that plough, or follow ploughs in the area, came to the same conclusion in that field, on that farm, and quickly flew off. A grassy patch that had attracted a prospective pair of scarce birds, woodlarks, was also ploughed under. Then came the chemicals, spraying weeds away and insects too that would otherwise feed hungry wildlife with their seeds and larvae. In my country, in Britain, half of the cereal harvest, the arable production, goes to feed factory farmed animals. And if we carry on like this, there's no wonder that the UN warns that our soils could be useless in just 60 years from now. Food production like this, intensification of cultivation of crops with animals confined on factory farms, looks like a space-saving idea, but actually isn't. And this is something which Tim Benton made very, very clear. Vast acreages of precious arable land elsewhere have to be devoted to growing feed for those confined animals. 40% globally of our grain harvest is fed to industrially reared animals. Now, if we fed that directly to people, it would sustain an extra 4 billion of us. Yet as animal feed, much of the food value is lost. Far from sparing land for nature, the reality is that intensive farming means that nature is sprayed away and farmland continues to expand. The bottom line is that our increasing global appetite for ever more meat from factory farms means clearing more forests worldwide for farmland. Our diets have gotten out of balance, over-dependent on meat and dairy, putting ecosystems under even greater pressure. In this age of pandemic, climate and biodiversity emergency, there is an urgent need to end factory farming and reduce the consumption of meat and dairy. So what could a better future look like? I see it as being a future-fit fusion of food, nature and animal welfare. Eating less and better meat from animals kept on nature-friendly farms where they can move freely and experience the joy of life. Mixed in rotation with crops, grown using natural predators and disease control instead of those chemicals and drugs. Worms instead of wormless. Soils instead of dirt. That to me is regenerative or agroecological farming, producing great food in a thriving countryside. Some of the best examples worldwide have pasture-raised chickens that follow sheep who follow cattle in a rich mixture of life. Farming in harmony with nature and animal welfare, combined with eating more plants and less meat, seems to me the way forward. A change is urgently needed. Time is running out, which is why we need to seize the opportunity of this year's UN Food Systems Summit dialogue to move toward a global agreement, to end factory farming, to reset our food system, to regenerative, restorative ways of producing food, farming nature with her, not against her, for all our sakes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Philip, for your impassioned plea. I think that comes out very, very clearly in the report that there is a need to get balance back into the way we feed our population. So thank you so much. And I very much like your anecdotes about soil worms instead of wormless. If you like, these are food system health indicators that we have to very much take to heart as we move into this dialogue. And I think there are things that are happening. The thing that worries me and has been worrying me for a few years since I moved from agribusiness and farming into working for the UN on much more on a policy side of things, is the fact that a lot of things are happening, but the prevailing system and the prevailing systemic lock-ins basically mean that these good examples, these grassroots examples, fail to really take root and get mainstreamed. So our next speaker, let's go to our next speaker. Our next speaker is somebody that I'm very proud to introduce. This is Dr. Jane Goodall, founder of the Jane Goodall Institute and UN Messenger of Peace. Dr. Jane Goodall is an ethologist and environmentalist, and she's very famous, of course, for going to Western Tanzania, as it was known then 60 years ago, to start to work on her groundbreaking work on the behavior of chimpanzees. Interestingly, of course, then she realized that while being there with the chimpanzees, she had to leave the forest, in fact, to work on saving them, and her work on deforestation and the loss. Jane, I'm very proud to introduce you because I went there in 1997 as a backpacker, and it's left a lasting impression on me. So please, floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I didn't prepare a speech because I didn't know what other people were going to say. So you'll have to excuse me if I come out with these thoughts. And first of all, it's very, very clear that we're facing an absolute crisis today. We're reaching a point of no return if we don't take action. I mean, I think that's really, really an important message. And I've seen it all. I mean, when I was young, farms were farms and animals roamed around in the fields, and there were clouds of rooks following a plow, and everything's changed. Everything's changed. And I think what I've learned from being in that rainforest is how everything is interconnected. And if we want to address the crisis that we face now, it's really important to think about all the different ways in which biodiversity loss is being affected. And yes, agriculture is having an amazing effect, a shocking effect on the loss of biodiversity, with land being taken up to grow crops. And kind of shocking that more grain is grown today to feed our livestock than to feed starving people. I find that a shocking statistic. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but I've heard it again and again. But so far, nobody's mentioned the other great loss of biodiversity in our oceans and our rivers, and the overfishing and the methods of fishing with drift nets and long lines and bottom dredging. It's causing tremendous loss of biodiversity in the oceans. And this too is leading to climate change. It's leading to a great deal of suffering among people who rely on food from the ocean, because it's getting less and less and less because of the commercial fishing. And I think if we're going to address this problem of loss of biodiversity and its relationship to agriculture, there's something very important that we have to address. And I come to this from my many years of being in Africa and working with very poor local communities. And we can make a choice. As was said earlier, we can go to a grocery store and we can make a conscious, ethical choice. Where did the food come from? Did it harm the environment? Was it cruel to animals? But if you're living in poverty, that's not possible. You cannot make those choices. And if you're in some rural area, you're going to cut down the last trees, which is causing loss of biodiversity, because you've over-farmed your land, very often with imported methods from the West, which were never used before. And so at the same time, you cause terrible erosion, and people are starving more and more because of this. And if you're in an urban area, you're going to buy that cheap junk food because you've got to feed your family, and you cannot afford to make those ethical choices, which everybody needs to make if we're going to get out of this terrible crisis that we've brought upon ourselves. So another aspect which I find very important is education, because an awful lot of the problems we face due to ignorance. And particularly among young people, it's so important that they understand this relationship between their food, what they eat, and climate change, loss of biodiversity, and their own future. So, as many people know, the Jane Goodall Institute began our program for young people, Roots and Shoots, where the young people tackle projects such as loss of biodiversity, such as agriculture and new ways of farming, which work with nature instead of destroying nature. And that program is now in 86 countries, and we're seeking ways to grow it because it is changing lives, and young people are changing their parents. And this is a very important aspect because some of those parents have key decision-making roles. So education is very important. And population growth, I know we can grow food in the right kind of way and support many more people. But the problem right now is that we've got about, I think it's meant to be 7.8 billion of us. And already in some areas, we're using up our natural resources, which are finite, faster than Mother Nature can replenish them. And so when it's predicted in 2050, there'll be closer to 10 billion of us. And as people rise up out of poverty, because people are addressing the poverty issue, as they rise out of poverty, what do they want to do? They want to emulate the kind of unsustainable lifestyles, the kind of, I mean, meat is a prized thing to serve to your neighbors if you come from a country that's rising out of poverty. And so that is moving that country away from the sustainable farming with less meat produced. And then finally, there's the people who are living on the land, the bushmeat trade in Africa, causing tremendous loss of biodiversity, the hunting, and we've talked about the fishing. And so if we try to address this from the different perspectives that will encourage people to help to move us towards a better world. And by the way, it's been repeated 3 times this afternoon, think globally, act locally. I don't want that. I want us to act locally, to do what you can where you are, which is what Roots and Shoots encourages. See that you're making a difference. Then you dare to think globally, because if you begin thinking globally, it's pretty depressing today, isn't it? With the media coming out with all the doom and gloom. So we need to address poverty. We need to address our unsustainable lifestyles. We need to educate people so that they understand the issues. We need to think about population growth and what's going to happen and how we're going to manage it while still retaining enough land to support the biodiversity that's so important. People must understand that we cannot dissociate ourselves from the natural world. We're part of it and we depend on it for clean air and water and food and clothing and everything else. So we have to develop a new relationship with the natural world. And I think the COVID pandemic is helping people understand that it's due to our disrespect of the natural world and our disrespect of animals, including all these farmed animals, that has led to a pandemic like this, because it's creating conditions which make it relatively easy for a pathogen like this virus to jump from an animal to a person. And if we don't create this new relationship with the natural world and with animals, there will be more pandemics, and they could be worse. We don't know. And so in all these different ways, we need to face the problem of cruelty, of ignorance, of poverty, of unsustainable lifestyles. We need to address corruption. And it's a massive, massive task ahead of us. And we need everybody to take action now. everybody to help in whatever way they can to move us towards a more sustainable planet for the sake of our children and theirs and all the animals that we share the planet with, or should share the planet with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goodall, for your excellent intervention. And I think, yes, you are right. Of course, it's not just think globally, it's local, it's both. We have to think locally and then feed that back up to the global as well. It's about making sure that we know what works also. Thank you so much. I'm during our panel session, I do hope we'll get the voice of the youth loud and clear, Jane, so we can maybe address some of these issues around the youth getting engaged, etc., in this dialogue. So thank you so much. Before we go to the panel discussion, and while I'm giving a little bit of an update, I'd like to ask all the panelists to open their cameras, please, so that you're all on screen. But just a little bit of just a bit of a reminder, please, if you do have a question, please do put it in the questions box. And at the same time, please also make sure that if you are from media, you absolutely say from where you are from and to whom you are asking your question. So as you can see on the screen, we have a brilliant panel, not only made up of our presenters, but also with two new fresh faces. And I thought I would, look, we're just going to do a sort of a 15-minute quick fire panel session. And I thought we could start, of course, with those that we haven't heard from yet. So that would be Lana. Can you tell me your surname? Because is it Wijdgenant?
It's Wijdgenant.
Wijdgenant, cool. I've said it before, but I just wanted to make sure. And Louise Mabulo. So look, Lana is actually a colleague of mine within the Action Track 2 of the Food Systems Summit, where she's the Youth Vice Chair of Action Track 2 on sustainable consumption patterns. And she's also the Deputy Partnerships Director at 0 Hour, an international youth-led climate justice organisation. So I would really love it, Alana, if we go to you first, then we'll go to you, Louise. But Alana, it's very, very clear that there's been a little bit of alarm and doom and gloom in this paper, a little bit about the state we are in, but there's also been a lot of, if you like, positivity around what we can do. And one of the clear points that's come out of this is around consumption, and the fact that consumption has to change to create the space, if you like, for more regenerative farming to actually take place. So you're in a great position to tell us and maybe dispel the despair that Jane put forward about the fact that youth are not really engaged, and we have to really get them moving, and so maybe you can enlighten us about your work and the positive viewpoint I think you have when it comes to engagement of youth in consumption of food. Over to you, Lana.
Thank you, James. And I also think that even though doom and gloom is criticized so often, it is really important to just tell the situation as it is and just be honest about our global situation, our ecological situation, because I think that's really the first step to appropriately taking on the actions that we need to as a world with climate change, with biodiversity loss, with the food systems issues that we're facing. And at the same time, we can be positive while telling the situation like it is. And I think one way that we can really see positivity and hope is through looking at what is already being done in youth movements. I started out engaging in youth movements through the climate strikes movement, which has gotten a lot of press coverage around the world with young people going to the streets and climate striking. But I think it's also important in something that is less covered is that young people are also engaging on issues like biodiversity and on food systems, and they're making these connections to how climate change is a large issue that we need to face for a sustainable future, and how changing diets and changing food systems has to be part of that. And that's something that I've been increasingly seeing. At 0 Hour, we did a week of coverage about how animal agriculture and livestock production connects to climate change as well as changing diets. There's a movement called Youth Climate Save, which has chapters around the world where young people are talking specifically about livestock production and about changing diets in climate change as well. And there are so many food systems movement with youth farmers, which are really amazing, and just making these connections between how this is something we need to confront. So this is already happening. So I think that's something important to acknowledge, that young people are already standing up on these issues, and we just need to amplify those and keep supporting them from the existing structures.
Thank you so much. Great. So lots of things happening, and maybe this is a bit of a kind of a segue over to Louise. And Louise, very happy to have you here. Louise Mabulo is a chef, farmer, and entrepreneur, and she's from the Philippines. And she's the founder of something called the Cacao Project, which cultivates resilient and climate-smart livelihoods where she lives. And also very happy to introduce you as a young champion of the earth from UNEP. So look, Louise, maybe you can give us a little bit of detail, I suppose, about what you are doing, and if you like, the momentum that's growing amongst the youth farmers to take on this the challenge in the field. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you so much, James, for that lovely introduction. And to talk a little bit about the work that we do, the Cacao Project is working with local smallholder farmers here in the Philippines to build disaster resilient and sustainable livelihoods that will kind of help them encourage them into rebuilding and rethinking the way that they are farming, and make that more regenerative, kind of include more biodiversity and how they can work with nature to produce better harvests. And also for farmers to be empowered and understand their value, because we live in a country where agriculture is heavily looked down upon. It's not looked at with high regard. And so it becomes problematic, because not only are farmers underpaid, but they're also kind of driven to do things that are destroying our biodiversity and our nature. And what we do is we try to equip them to avoid that, and equip them that they can understand their value to our economy, because our entire economy is reliant on agriculture, but also be able to empower them and understand their value to our nature and environment, and to the global community as a whole. And right now in the Philippines, I mean, we've been suffering from typhoons. In the last December, we've suffered one of the strongest typhoons, which we call Typhoon Rolly. And it's so problematic that our farmers have lost a lot of their livelihoods, lose a lot of their crops. And these communities are reliant on food systems, on agriculture, farming, but they're also the greatest kind of community and industry of people who are affected by the world's decisions because of climate change. And so what we want to do is not just on one side empowering them, but spread awareness about how these communities are affected by our biodiversity loss, and how our food systems are impacting these people in third world countries that we don't see. And the pandemic, I think, has highlighted so much for young people, especially, who are going back to their provinces, going back to their hometowns, and inheriting land from their families in countries like mine. They're starting to understand their value as young people, not just in the climate movement and in environmentalism, but in helping their parents kind of intervene in their livelihoods and their farming practices. And so slowly, since the pandemic had started, I've been seeing more young people speak up about climate issues, speak up about farming issues in my country, and how those link together. Because before, we would not really put food and climate and environment in the same sentence. But now people are starting to understand how those things are so closely interrelated, and more young people, thankfully, are starting to see their potential as stewards to our environment within food systems, and how they can integrate environmental stewardship into agriculture.
Thank you so much, Louise. Fantastic. And you know, what I think is so clear is that there are very encouraging signs across the world. You know, there are lots and lots of farmers practicing regenerative agriculture, agroforestry. They till their land using minimal tillage or zero tillage techniques, and it's not just confined to smallholders. I mean, it goes across all the way through to large scale farmers too. I think the question that I have really is that how does it all come together, bearing in mind that at the moment there are disparate bits all over the place. But it's very reassuring as a father of 3 young sons to know that youth is engaged and not disappearing around the corner to McDonald's all the time. Or, well, you know, maybe they are, but maybe not as much as they were. Susan, I'd like to bring you back in because you have the advantage of speaking first. And I think one of the things that so Jane mentioned the issue of blue food and the issue of the oceans, right? And so it rather took away the question that I was going to ask you. But as somebody who is, if you like, on a journey of discovery when it comes to really land-based issues around agriculture, etc., and your basis of your work has been in the past around marine, do you think for some countries this could be an entry point, bearing in mind that you are seeing quite a lot of runoff and quite a lot of nutrient overload in coastal areas from the agriculture sector and the food? I'd be interested to hear your views.
Well, thanks, James. And the speakers that have talked today have been just phenomenal in outlining the issue and explaining the urgency and the passion for why this is so important now. Yeah, one of the challenges of working in marine systems is that it's if you're trying to look at the size of a population, you have to use all these indicators. You can't count them directly most of the time, although technology is helping to change that to some extent. But it would be like trying to figure out how many trees you have in the forest where you couldn't actually look at the forest. You weren't quite sure how big it was. So there are a lot more challenges when it comes to marine. But I think one thing that is true for both terrestrial and marine is that people are starting to understand and appreciate the interconnection between their own lives and these habitats. Whether, it used to be that if you lived on the coast, you understood that the oceans might be relevant to you. Now, I think that we're seeing that through better communication, people far away from a coast who maybe have never visited an ocean are beginning to understand that there are these interconnections. And it comes a lot through what Jane was talking about in terms of the essential education and the raising of awareness. And I think it also comes from what we heard from Lana in terms of needing these really clear examples of what are those success stories? Because I think that's what really empowers people, be it whatever ecosystem you're talking about, helping to empower people through seeing concrete actions they can take, concrete success stories that have worked, that can work in your community, or that you can insist would work with your government. So I'll just say, you didn't ask this, but I just want a chance to say, I am a stubborn optimist about a lot of these things. I know we've lost so much, but I do see the potential of the future because particularly during COVID, we saw that people can adapt. When they start to when things come in front of them and they can see it, they can adapt. And we've seen that. And I have a lot of faith, like others here, in terms of the youth being much more aware than previous generations because of their sharing of information, and much more empowered to understand the impacts of their action. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Susan. Of course, I think if you're dealing with coastal and marine issues, the systemic elements of what is causing issues in the ocean, I think, come very, very clearly when you start to look at the food and agriculture sector. So thank you for that. So I want to go to Tim, then Philip, and then finish with Jane. Tim, one of the things that, and I'm going to ask roughly the same question to Philip, but Tim, if you could kind of choose for the summit some really big ticket items, some real systemic lock-ins that can be addressed at the summit, what would you choose? Bearing in mind that we're talking about systems here, we're not talking about how to kind of improve irrigation or improve nutrient management. This is about systems. So what system lock-ins would you like to see addressed at the summit? Over.
So the first one, I think, is a mindset change to recognize that it is a system. And if you look, for example, at COP26, the climate COP, food is there, but food is there from how can you make agriculture sustainable perspective. It's not there from how can we change the demand to help people eat more healthily and reduce the footprint of what they eat on the land. Traditionally, we have chunked agriculture up into the production side, and it sits with environment ministries and farming ministries, and we have health side, which is on the other side, and those two don't talk to each other. So the first mindset change is to say, actually, changing the demand function can lead to so many co-benefits because people are healthier, we reduce our healthcare bills, and we reduce the footprint on the planet. And it shouldn't be toxic to go there. And it shouldn't be all technology focused about how do we make the supply side more efficient. It should be about how do we make the system more efficient. So that would be number one. And then number two is about recognizing that food is integral to making people healthier, the Nutrition for Growth Summit. Food is integral for making biodiversity better, CBD. Food is integral for dealing with climate change, UNEP. But each one of those deals with the parts in different ways. And so you often get a misalignment of activity that comes out of climate change that doesn't read across to nature-based solutions for biodiversity, which doesn't read across to sustainable diets to drive better health for the Nutrition for Growth Summit. And for me, the Food System Summit should pull all of these things together and really adopt a systemic approach. And then my final thing in terms about lock-in, beyond the mindset change, the lock-in that we have is that we incentivize through subsidies, through reducing trade barriers, through many, many, many ways, we incentivize production for economic growth over and above any other considerations. So in a global trading system, any country that externalizes its costs onto the environment gets a competitive advantage. And for me, that's the biggest lock-in, because that drives a race to the bottom in every country that produces food, because you're competing against other people who are getting cheaper goods. So dealing with trade and making the rules of trade in the WTO more supportive of sustainability criteria, and not just narrow safety and health criteria in terms of plant health, but broader climate and environmental issues, I think is the number one lock-in that I think will have the biggest change. Over.
Thank you so much, Philip. There's a hard act to follow, because the sort of the framework of that. But is there anything that you would like to see? Now, look, you mentioned outlawing factory farms, etc., or creating an agreement, if you like, to kind of phase those out or to improve them. Maybe you could, assuming that's it, how would you like to bring that into the summit?
Well, I would agree with Tim that we need a mindset change. We need a recognition that industrial agriculture, far from being the solution for the future, is actually the problem. That's the key penny that needs to drop. And once we've recognized that industrial agriculture, factory farming of crops and animals is the problem, we then need to frame policies and subsidy regimes that move us away from that way of farming. The reality is that our current industrial agricultural system is locked in by decades of government policy, encouragement and funding. In the European Union, the Common Agricultural Policy; in the US, the Farm Bill; in the UK, the Agriculture Act of 1947, and now in a post-Brexit Britain has the opportunity to recast its subsidies around public money for public goods. So redirecting towards nature-friendly farming. That is the possibility. And let's hope that let's work to make sure it comes about. So I think the key thing is recognizing what is the problem, industrial agriculture, governments and corporates taking leadership and not simply saying, let consumers and the market decide. That is shirking responsibility. Take leadership, put in place policy regimes and fiscal policies, subsidy redirection. Or another way could be taxes, tax on bad food, so factory farmed meat, and use that money to make more nature friendly, healthy food more affordable to everyone. So I think one of the key things is to move away from industrial agriculture, policy and subsidy regimes that will move us to a situation where decent food, nature-friendly, welfare-friendly food is an absolute human right for everyone. That would be my answer.
Thank you, Philip. So just, I mean, what I think is great about this is and we're going through this process. Even yesterday evening, Susan and I, we were on a brainstorming session, if you like, within the context of the summit about, you know, the summit is just a place in time. What happens afterwards? How do we think the blue sky? How do we create that North Star moment? Look, before we go to questions, I would just like to give the floor back to Jane, and I'd like to hear just some very brief reflections on what you've heard, and especially I think the positivity that I feel very much from Lana and Louise about the future of the youth and their influence.
Well, when I reflect on what I've heard, everybody's talked sense, which is great, very understandable, and it's very clear what we need to do. And all of us have understood this for some time, but an awful lot of people don't. And I maintain that a lot of politicians who say they don't really understand this, that, and the other. I mean, like Donald Trump saying climate change wasn't real. He can't have actually believed that, but it's preferable for some people to say that it's not important because they want to put their heads in the sand and carry on doing what they're doing and make money and more money and more money. So that this desire for a successful person is somebody who makes a lot of money and gets a lot of power. That has to change. That's terribly important. And that's what's leading to all the corruption. And that's what's leading to subsidizing all this intensive farming. It's all to do with money, money, money. Money's become a god. And, you know, I always come back again to the importance of alleviating poverty. And it's not just that people can't afford to make good choices. It's not just they cut down the trees to desperate to get more land to grow enough food to survive. They have to be helped and guided or permitted and subsidized to turn to alternative livelihoods. I mean, we found that with our big program all around the reserves in Africa, where the communities are very poor, that once they have alternative ways of living, like starting a little tree nursery, we give them microcredit based on Muhammad Yunus's Green Bank. He's one of my heroes. And so when they have an alternative livelihood, then they begin to actually appreciate that saving the environment is important for their own future generations, not just wildlife. And so it ties the whole thing together, saving biodiversity and improving lifestyles, alleviating poverty, and helping people move forward to this brave new world. And hope, my 2 reasons for hope, yes, number 1 is the young people. I've seen it in all 86 countries. And our program, by the way, is kindergarten, university, post-university, and everything in between. And the young people make their own choices as to what they do to make the world better, but interconnected, 1 for people, 1 project for animals, 1 project for the environment. And second reason for hope is the resilience of nature. Give nature a chance. And these places that we've destroyed, this soil that we've killed, give it time, give it some help, and it will regenerate. It will again support biodiversity. It'll never be quite the same perhaps, but it still will again move us into the kind of world that we must help all of you young people to create. Otherwise, if we go on stealing your future with our corporate and our governmental interests and our greedy desire for money, and it was Gandhi who said, my last words, this planet can provide for human need, but not human greed.
Thank you so much. Well, that concludes, on very wise words, our panel. And I'd like to thank you all for sort of being candid, being ambitious, being honest. I think this is really important. So I think just because we only have 15 minutes left, we're going to go straight to question and answer. So the first question is, what does Tim, so this is for you, specifically, what does Tim think, right? What does Tim think of the role of alternative proteins in future food security and biodiversity? And I'll give you a short, brief window to answer that.
It would be interesting to hear other people's view. On a global average basis, every region of the world overconsumes protein on average. So the first thing I would say is, do we need to produce alternative proteins, or do we need to share the proteins that we already produce in a better way, eating the right amount rather than eating more than we require from a nutritional perspective? And if we ate the right amount of proteins, we wouldn't be so tending towards obesity and all of the diseases that associate with. So number 1, are alternative proteins necessary? Questionable. Number 2, I'm sure there are many ways of producing alternative proteins that will create some form of future range in diets, whether it is mycoproteins from mushrooms and fungi, or whether it is insects or whatever it might be, stem cell meat. My slight worry, being completely open, is that new forms of industrial production of proteins risk maintaining a corporate hegemony over the food system, and the ones most to benefit will be large-scale food companies with multinational supply chains, whereas actually a healthier diet might be better represented by eating less processed foods, more whole foods, cooked at home, more plant-based products, rather than an industrial produced stem cell burger instead of an industrial produced beef burger. Over.
Thank you so much. It's a complex one because it's like, you were saying, well, look, protein is still protein, and if actually what this report says is that yes, let's invest in other things, but in fact, if we do it correctly and in a balanced way, we don't need all these alternative proteins. And I think this I think is something that was clear, that's been clear to me for a few years now. Okay, so second question, and I'm just going to whip through these, and this is to you, Susan, on the spot. Shouldn't government subsidies reflect the impact on biodiversity? This would send a clear message to food producers and make sustainably ethically sourced foods cheaper. What's your response to that?
I think that's an important point that's made through all kinds of activities, economic activities that have an impact. That the previous traditional models didn't take into account the holistic cost of that, or they deferred the cost of the impacts later to a future generation or to the public sector to catch up on. And so certainly taking a closer look at not only the things that are being subsidized, but also the effects of economic activities and the options in terms of what's the cost of doing it now more sustainably versus what's the cost of using a business as usual type approach and then having really strong impacts down the line. So very important conversation. I think we're seeing more and more of those conversations taking place.
Thank you so much. I think this idea of stimulating good and rewarding good practices rather than perpetuating bad, which I think is quite clear. Sometimes when you look, well, often when you look at the way historically, for example, input subsidies have been organized in the agriculture sector, I think this is something, if you like, a big ticket item that we could push. Okay, so sorry, I'm trying to scroll through the questions as well. I'm moderating. Philip, how do we encourage change in farming practices and have constructive conversations with farmers who have historically been and are currently encouraged to prioritize yield, building on what
I think the first thing is to put those pioneering farmers that are already doing the right thing, and there are many of them, put them on a pedestal and let them talk to the farming community. It's you know I think that's the way to move forward in this way, to allow farmers to speak for themselves within their industry. The second point is coming back to what we were saying earlier. It's no accident that we've got to this point where industrial agriculture has become dominant. It's because of decades of government policy and subsidy. So the other way is for governments to talk to farmers through the public purse in a better way, a more progressive way than they've done in recent decades. So encourage farmers, reward farmers through policy incentives and subsidy rewards, and make sure that we empower and amplify the many farmers who are already doing the right thing and embracing nature-friendly, agroecological ways of producing food across the planet.
Thank you so much. Yeah, agreed. This goes to Lana and Louise because we're running out of time a bit, so I'm going to ask you to both think about this. And this, look, it doesn't matter how much education or awareness there is. If people can't afford to make the right choices, what can be done to make regenerative agriculture and fisheries affordable? And I'll go to Louise first. If you could focus maybe on this idea of how can sustainable regenerative agriculture become more affordable, and then over to Lana, if you could reflect on the consumption issue in that as well, that would be great. So Louise, floor is yours.
Definitely. I think in terms of this issue, it's important to see that a lot of agricultural systems are quite broken, where we have vast lands of food deserts and people who have no access to food, but it costs them quite a lot. If we localize kind of produce and harvest and encourage people to support local farmers, local producers, and then make sure that people have access to those and kind of get rid of vast monocultures and make sure that people understand the value of local farmers, local producers, and that's really important. Another thing that I would like to talk about is self-sufficiency, where in the pandemic, because supply chains were quite broken down and people were having difficulty with borders, well, we need to encourage communities to be more self-sufficient in terms of how they produce food. Instead of getting it from faraway places, try to make sure that we have community gardens or food hubs for farmers to bring their produce to, and encourage better logistics and road systems that make farmers have a more accessible route to our markets. And another thing was, we need to normalize regenerative and sustainable agriculture and change the language surrounding agriculture, restructure our agricultural system so that regenerative and sustainable will become normal. It will become the more accessible option to people in low-income houses. It'll be the better priced produce, and then maybe change the language so that bad food will become kind of the minority and will become less accessible to people. So I guess it's a huge systems change that we need to tackle.
So I want to quickly highlight 2 points from the report. And first of all is that the key shift in diets must be not to regenerative agriculture and sustainable fisheries, but to converge more around diets based more on plants. And that's because of the disproportionate impact of livestock production on biodiversity, on land use, and on the environment. And it's also important to acknowledge that this dietary shift towards more plant-based diets will be necessary in order to enable more widespread adoption of nature-friendly farming that we're talking about without increasing the pressure to convert natural land. Also in Action Track 2 for the UN Food Systems Summit, something else that we're looking at is that we must not make just these more healthy and sustainable diets more desirable, but also more available and accessible. So we do acknowledge this link is vitally important.
Thank you so much. And yes, of course, I think all these points are very pertinent, and it makes me very excited about the coming 6 months, because the next 6 months, I think, is where all these things are going to come together, hopefully, to at least start the conversation of joining the dots, getting the system thinkers together, but also, like Tim said, getting that mindset change. So, gosh, plenty to go forward. Oh, ignore that. Can people hear me? Yeah. Okay. Great. So we have one last question, actually, that I'd like to put to Jane, and that will be the last question of the session before I wrap up. And this is from a media house, and it's really from a not-for-profit sentient media house, and it's around the role of animals in our daily lives. And I think the question here, Jane, is around, after so many generations of focusing on, if you like, the livestock sector, in many ways has promoted the health benefits of livestock products. How do we ally that to the idea that, in fact, there has to be change, and it's not just health we have to worry about, it's also the environmental impact?
Well, I'm not sure I heard all of that, but you broke up on me.
Sorry. Maybe I can. Do you want me to re-say it?
Just a short bit.
Okay, great. It's a question around livestock farmers that have been, quite rightly in many ways, promoting the health benefits of dairy and meat products. How do we create a mindset change with livestock farmers to start to realize the connectivity from health to also environment when it comes to livestock farming?
Okay, well, it actually comes back to what I said before, which is if farmers are going to change and realize that or accept and admit the cruelty of the systems that they're using, admit that animals are sentient and have feelings and can feel fear and pain, admit the cruelty that they're inflicting. At the moment, an awful lot of people employed in these intensive farms, either they they're doing it because they just have to get a job and they have to get money, or they are basically believing that animals are just things. The way that they're treated when you see some of these films that are secretly made in the intensive farms, they make you absolutely sick. And so if farmers will admit that, but they're not going to admit it until they have an alternative way of making money. And that, I think, is so important. Help them to move from intensive animal agriculture into this environmentally friendly, animal friendly, future friendly way of creating food to feed people. And I think that's tremendously important. And I just want to add one thing, which isn't the question. But you know, I was really lucky, I think. I grew up in World War II. Food was rationed. Every mouthful we took, we valued. 1 square of chocolate was a treat. So today, until we've alleviated this poverty, which we're trying to do desperately, but let's take the people who are not living in poverty, and we want them to make these wise choices. People say to me, but this organic food, this friendly food is more expensive, so I'm not buying it. Well, okay, it's more expensive. You value it more and you waste less. And the waste of food is something I don't think was, well, maybe it was mentioned, but I missed it. The food we waste could feed thousands of people. And so valuing the food, helping the farmers to move into other ways of making their living and more friendly environmental, animal, and human health ways.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And thank you very much, Jane. And I saw Tim a wry smile at me because he knows I have to now do the sum up. I'd first of all like to thank all of you, Dr. Goodall, Susan, Lana, Tim, Philip, Louise, all for giving up your valuable time.
I have a name too. I'm Jane. Why must I be Dr.
Sorry,
Goodall?
I don't know actually. I'm not quite sure. I have been saying Jane the whole way. I do apologize.
Say it now. Don't make me feel an outcast from this group.
Oh no. I think actually it's because it's up there as the first thing for your name. So do apologize. So Jane, thank you very much for giving up your time. So everything that's been said, I think is doable, and I think after the last few years, I think of quite a lot of us in this space being quite negative about whether we can get to a tipping point with the food system. I think finally we're getting into a situation where we're having more activities, grassroots level activities on the ground. We're getting to a point where there's political will, the system's changed, there's an understanding that consumption patterns are linked to production of patterns. There's an understanding that it's not all about productivity. Having said that, productivity is still very important. There's an understanding that if we do go into a transformational or a transitional phase within our food system, those that might lose out in the short term need to be supported. We need to be inclusive. So all of these things, I'm glad to say, are the ambition of the Food Systems Summit. And one of the things that we have to do, as all of us that are part of this, is that we realize that whatever we do between February and September is just setting the stage for a much longer, wider discussion about how we're going to make true change that lasts. And that means a change in governance. That means a change maybe in the way institutions are set up, including, dare I say it, the UN. So thank you so much. It's been really great, very interesting. I've had a great time, and just I'm going to leave you with one thought. That is, we've heard about the what, where we have to get to, and the why. But what we have to focus on, I think, collectively, is the how. How are we going to do that? And I think this is something that we have to work collectively on, be ambitious about, using the momentum being built by the UN Food System Summit to get to a point where we are in a place where we can see a very good future for our food system. So thank you so much. And I look forward to seeing you all again sometime soon. Bye-bye.